So our form has come along very nicely and we're pretty much done in terms of feature completion. However, we need to complete this final picture and get our one-way data binding fully hooked up. Now, what do we mean by one-way data binding? We're kind of allowing our form to do all the work for us. We're just binding an ng model. It then generates this object. We press create. It sends the event up to our parent component. And that's then pretty much it, right? What we want to do is now introduce this concept of either an empty object to initialize our form, or we're going to provide an object definition, which will then allow us to, for example, click on one of our items and then render it in this single view. So what I want you to do is, like I've done, is just take any piece of data that you fancy from our list, copy it, we'll close off our donut list. So what we're going to do, because we have this donut single component, we're going to create a donut property. Here we need to use that exclamation syntax because we're going to tell Angular that this property is going to have a value inside of our ng-on-init rather than our constructor. So what we essentially want to do now inside of our ng-on-init is bind this.donut to the value of one of our items. When we hit save, this won't actually make any changes in our browser because we're not passing this item down. So at the moment, what we're essentially doing is providing the capability for all of our components to have all the data, respond to the data, take the data, pass events, change it, whatever we want to do. And then in the final chapter, we're then going to hook everything up to some routing. And all of this is then going to happen dynamically with HTTP requests and so much more. This is exciting for us to implement. So at the moment, we have an object definition. We've got an ID, name, icon, price, limited. So what we want to do, let's assume that we've just clicked on one of those items. We need to then pass that particular donut down. So here we're going to create a property, and then we're going to take our donut value and pass it down here. Now I'm also going to call the property that we bind to on the form as the donut as well, which means before we want to save, we're going to see errors. We can jump into our donut form component. Now this is just me, my personal preference. I always like to put the input import first, then output and event emitter. Of course, you can do it in any order, but I think input, output makes more sense. So we can jump back down into the component body. So what we essentially want to do is provide that input. Now we called this the property of donut, so we can say that is then going to be of type donut. Now because we are passing this as an input, we then need to specify our exclamation to tell TypeScript that it is going to be available. Because it doesn't get assigned in the constructor or ng-on-init, it gets passed down and magically bound via Angular. So this then allows us to get access to our donut, that object from our parent. Remember, the parent, our container, is the component that's in charge of fetching the data. So we can imagine that this is a server request that goes and dynamically fetches the data, then binds it via ng-on-init to our component. We then delegate all that data down into our form component. The form can then be managed, edited, whatever. We then hit save. Our create event then fires and everything works perfectly. So at this point, we can save out our donut single and we want to go back into our donut form and also save this out. So at the moment, we have essentially passed the data, but we're not rendering anything in the DOM. So the way that we can see these values, if we do something like this, we can create another pre-tag and just pipe out our donut object to JSON. So when we save this out, we then see pretty much the mirror image. Of course, we have created the IDs, which we're then going to allow our database to assign dynamically. We're not going to set those manually inside of our form, but we have the name, the icon, the price, promo, and the description, which then of course mimic our object below. So what we essentially want to do, because we're not creating something new, we want to set up the ability to bind an existing piece of data via one-way data flow. So to do this, how do you think we could do it? We could look at our first input, which is our input type of text, which is our name field. So we want to bind our name. Now, ng-model is going to take any model and value that's assigned to our input and then spawn up this property, which is then bound to our ng-form instance. So you may be thinking that we could do something like this and bind the value, and we could say something like donut.name. If we then hit save, we see nothing being assigned. And that is because ngModel is essentially overriding this value. So instead of using value, what if we bound to ngModel using a one-way binding syntax and passed in the donut name? So what this essentially does is say, we want to track all changes via ngModel. Because we are using those square brackets, we're then supplying an initial value. So if we then hit save, we then see, firstly, our object below, the form value, now contains our initial value up here, but also our form field also contains the value. So this allows us to, one, specify an empty object, if we want to then create an empty form, to allow the user to then create a new product, but it also allows us to click on an existing product and then bind all the data down. So what's actually really easy now is we just need to simply supply square bracket syntax and simply bind the right properties. So we can say, I want to bind the value, if there is one, of our donut.icon. We can then hit save, and if you watch, our just chocolate has now been selected. We can scroll down, jump into our price. We want to square bracket bind, supply that donut.price value, hit save. Our price is then reflected in our form. Now this is quite an interesting one, and we've deliberately left this as not validated. Now this is because you cannot unselect a radio button once we've in fact selected it. So what we're going to use is ngModel and then supply some bindings. So here we can select all the items at once. We can say ngModel equals donut.promo. So then when we hit save, this is then going to select that limited value. Now if we select none as well, you can see that this is then removed from our object property. So this is nice, and what this will allow us to do in our parent, if the promo property doesn't exist, you can see that by default, our option of none is selected. So the user can refresh and they can try to remove things, but it won't in fact allow them. And if we were to inspect element and remove the selected option, it doesn't really matter or make any difference because it's an optional property for us. So with this in mind, let's jump into our last form field and start binding that ngModel. We can square brackets equals donut.description. We get some nice auto-completion with our type because we've specified that type definition. And it's always good, and this is a thing that I like to do, is to make sure that all my types are then wired up correctly so we can hover over things and we can see that our IntelliSense is giving us a nice helping hand. So when we save this out, all of our form fields now essentially match because we've bound, apart from our ID, all of the values to our inputs. And you can see even our price of 119, which is of type number, not a string, is also being reflected. And we can go and change these values. The great thing about this, and this is why I really encourage you to use one-way data flow, is because you can see our form, if we then start changing these values, is being changed. We can then start changing these details. No properties on our initial object are being changed. And this is the whole idea behind one-way data flow. So what this means is, let's say we have a save somewhere else. We then have this piece of data updated, and what Angular will then do is then pass the new data down to our donut form. And because the data only flows one way, if a new value appears, it will then just simply go and render it, which then in turn goes and updates our model. So what we essentially want to do in the next chapter, and this is a really nice piece, is move our application state out of our component into a service. And we're going to talk about some different approaches that we can take, why we should take them, and much more. But at the moment, we have created a very nice form. It abides by all the rules of one-way data flow. We don't mutate any values. We simply bind any initial values using a one-way data flow syntax to our ngModel. Now you can use two-way data binding with ngModel, but this will then start changing our initial object, which defeats the whole purpose of using one-way data flow. So I'm not teaching you that approach. I'm teaching you the good habits that you can then carry forward and have a much more predictable state management and a far easier to manage application and code base. And in the next few chapters, as we then finish off the rest of our application, you're really going to then start to see all these concepts come into life and how easy it is for us to then manage our application, the state updates, and so much more. We're also going to be building out some more functionality. We're going to have creation, updating our objects, some redirects with our routing, and adding as many useful and very common features as we can. So with this in mind, let's carry on and jump into the next chapter.